All right, I'm going to have our friend Katie here. She's going to share some amazing news before Megan shares her presentation. Gunastish.
Gunastish. I'm Katie Bunn-Marcuse, and I, in addition to some of the other things at University of Washington that I do, I edit the series, the Bill Holmes Center series in Northwest Native Art for the University of Washington. And this is the series in which Megan Smetzer's wonderful book, Painful Beauty, Tlingit Women, Beadwork, and the Art of Resilience came out in that series. And I have a very exciting announcement that came out earlier this week, just on Tuesday. On Tuesday, the Smithsonian American Art Museum has awarded the 36th Annual Charles C. Eldridge Prize for Distinguished Scholarship in American Art to Megan Smetzer for her book, Painful Beauty. So for those of you who don't know, this is the premier prize in American art history for books. So I'm like full of goosebumps. And it's very, very well worth it. The jury said of the book that what they appreciated was, quote, we deeply appreciate Smetzer's relational approach, a strategy from Indigenous studies that's becoming essential in the 21st century. Her close readings counter settler colonial perspectives and convey the memories, histories, and clan affiliations embedded in the designs of moccasins, beaded regalia, dance collars, and contemporary design. Painful Beauty integrates contextual material, attentive object-based interpretations informed by Tlingit aesthetics, archival research, first-hand interviews, and through her study of previously ignored women's contributions and the matrilineal history of Tlingit culture, there are compelling intergenerational connections. And I just am so pleased in this prize. I think it's so well-deserved, and it is a huge step in acknowledging the contributions of the regalia that women made that kept culture going through the 19th and 20th century. So congratulations to you.
Gunastish to Katie, Gunastish to all of the beaders, past and present, to the elders, to the scholars, and to the artists who have talked with me over the years. I started this project many, many years ago as a young PhD student at the University of British Columbia. And I, finished that up. I presented it here in Sitka in the 2007 Sharing Our Knowledge conference. And so it's so exciting and humbling for me to be here in order to share this book with you, as well as a little bit of kind of what didn't get into the book, because this is how book projects happen. You want to tell all of the stories, but they don't always happen. Again, I just feel like being here in Sitka wáan is an amazing place to be able to share also the awarding of that prize, which I did not expect at all. I was really just kind of blown away by that. I don't know if Ishmael's in the audience. I want to just shout out to Ishmael Hope, because he was one of the people who read my manuscript a couple of times and helped me with some historical things and made sure I was using the language and had it spelled correctly, where I was able to incorporate it into this book. So there are many people in museums. This came out during COVID. I had people sneaking around in museums taking photographs for me because I wanted these beautiful cultural belongings to appear in the book. And so, Lucy Williams at University of Pennsylvania Museum, Jackie here at the Sheldon Jackson Museum, they did really amazing things so that this book could end up being the form that it's in. Is that Shken out there? Hi, Shken. I'm so glad you're here. Shken was one of the artists I got to include in this book as well, and it's just really makes me so happy to see you here in the audience. It's wonderful. So just for those of you who don't know me, I'm a settler scholar. I was born and raised in Fairbanks, Alaska, but I grew up knowing a lot of beaders because my mom adored beadwork. She supported beaders. She bought a lot of their work. So I was always surrounded by how beautiful it was and how, I always loved that. I went off to college on the East Coast, and after a number of years, I got really homesick. And I thought, I'm going to go back to Fairbanks and see if I can do a project on Athabascan beading, because that was what I knew. But as I shared at Sharing Our Knowledge a few years ago, a long time ago, I opened this drawer in the museum collections, and I saw octopus bags for the first time. And I was like, I don't know what this is, and I don't know why I don't know what this is. And so that kind of set me on this path to understanding the history of beading in Southeast Alaska. And from there, I really started to come to understand how rich that history is, how important beading was to continue cultural practices into the present day. And I tried to capture some of that here in this book. I currently live in Vancouver, Canada, in the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I teach at Capilano University, named after Squamish chief Joe Capilano, who was a fighter for Coast Salish people. He traveled to England to meet with King Edward. He traveled to Ottawa to meet with the Prime Minister of Canada in about 1906 and 1908. And so, really that kind of aspect of social justice is something that is always a part of the work that I do with the students that I teach. And I hope that this book, for those of you who've read it, I know some of you have read it and I've gotten some really lovely feedback, that this is kind of contributing in some small way to writing some of the historical imbalances that came about because of settlers coming in here and imposing other ways of knowing in this place. So today I'm just going to give a very, very brief overview of the structure of the book, share one little small story that I'm interested in learning more about, and then hopefully opening up the floor with a little bit of time, if I don't talk too much, which is sometimes a problem, to have a conversation about what other kinds of stories might be valuable for the community, for us to look into, to talk about, and so forth. So I'm going to go from there. I'm a little wound up from Katie's announcement, so I'm going to try and slow it down. Again, a lot of people ask me about the title, Painful Beauty, and I want to acknowledge Della Cheney, who had a conversation with me in 2009 at a gathering of weavers and beaders in Juneau, just before celebration of that year. And she said, do you know what beading means to Tlingit people? And I was like, well, I've done some research, I have this kind of intellectual understanding of it. But she said, well, people loved the beads coming in. They were so beautiful. There was so much you could do with them. She said, but at the same time came disease, came missionization, came a lot of really negative things that were really painful. And I was like, oh, she got me. That was it. It went from my head, it went to my heart. And from that point on, I had that idea in my mind. A few months later, I was taking a train to Montreal, and there's this huge billboard. And this is a billboard called Fringe by the Anishinaabe artist known as Rebecca Belmore. And it is, if you can see, it's a little small, but it's of a reclining woman. Strung from her back are pieces of sinew strung with red beads. And this is to point out the impact of colonialism on women, on indigenous women. But what she says about this particular piece is that because it's a scar, because it's been sewn up, that there's a possibility for healing that trauma. And so between speaking with Della and seeing this particular amazing piece of art by Rebecca Belmore, I thought, this is what it's all about. It's about beauty, but it's also about pain. And so that's kind of where the title came from. I also was inspired by the wonderful late Clarissa Rizal. She and I often had conversations when we happened to be in Juneau at the same time, where we talked about women's role, women's arts, and how a lot of that knowledge was sidelined. That knowledge was not, celebrated in the same kinds of ways. And so I think about this robe that she made, the resilience robe, where she is lifting up women and she's reclaiming that equal footing that was, again, sidelined because of institutions of settler colonialism. And so the subtitle of this book, Tlingit Women, Beadwork, and the Art of Resilience, is really, again, is an homage to Clarissa Rizal and our many conversations over the years. So I'm really grateful to her. So This book is structured really in 4 case studies, plus 2 of them set in the 19th century, 1 set in the 20th century, mid-20th century, and 1 that looks at contemporary artists and their referencing of beadwork. And then I have a short epilogue that crosses that border between the United States and Canada. So I grew up in Alaska, but I live in Canada now, and that border just gets in the way of a lot of work and a lot of business. And so I'm always interested in thinking about that. I just have these words here by Louis Shotridge. An invader might satisfy himself in saying that the native customs and habits have about disappeared, but could the lid of the true woman's mind be thrown wide open, there would be seen the mystic veneration of her art still alive and active. And I just think this is, really a touchstone for this this research, is that this knowledge is in the community. This knowledge has always been there, and it's just not been paid attention to by academics, by museums. And so, I feel like this is, focusing on Louis Shotridge, you kind of understand that even in the early 20th century, he recognized that as well. He recognized that sidelining of women's knowledge. So again, I just want to say, I'm grateful to the folks here who shared with me, and just really so important to that. I also wanted to foreground some of the cultural values that are really significant to Tlingit ways of being in the world, and so that's kind of woven through the entire book. And this, of course, is all built on a lot of research that I did in museum collections, photographing as much beadwork as I could come across, and archives. There's nothing really written about beading in the 19th century, just little glimpses here and there, but the photographs are just a wealth of knowledge. And so looking at those in combination with other sorts of documents and with speaking with people is really where this research came from. So just to begin, I'm going to try and share just some of my favorite stories. This is one of my favorite stories. This particular pair of moccasins is housed at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. And when I did research there, the only information that was associated with these moccasins was the name of the woman who donated them to the museum. Her name was Mary Sharpless Schaefer, and a small note that wrote, quote, "moccasins made by a Sitka Indian woman," end quote. That was it. And I was just always fascinated by that and by this S and that foliate form, which at that time I did not know was seaweed, but have learned. And I was, I've always was like, gosh, it'd be amazing to know who the woman was who beaded this particular pair of moccasins and what that story is. Well, a few years later, when Google became a thing, and I was working on my book, I thought maybe I'll just Google the woman who collected these moccasins and see what I can find. Turns out there's a biography written about her, and so I was like, oh, I better read that. So I read that, and in the end of the chapter, the biographer says, talks about this trip she had to Alaska, which she created a fictionalized account of this trip. And in the second to last sentence in this paragraph, she says, and she, brought back this pair of moccasins. She acquired this pair of moccasins in the story. And I was like, oh my gosh, there's the moccasins. And so I contacted the archives, which are in Banff, Alberta, that had that unpublished manuscript, and had it photocopied. And so there's this very romantic story of this young girl coming off the steamship and meeting a young woman from Sitka whose husband had disappeared 2 years earlier when he was seal hunting, and she was ill, and she was a young Christian woman, so she probably, maybe lived in the cottages, and they had this kind of amazing connection. And then she writes about the fact that this young woman, the ship was sailing, and this young woman comes running up to the ship and gets these moccasins passed to her. And on one is the S, which is her last name, Sharpless, and on the other was love, all love. And so I was just thought, this is a brilliant, that, this story is here, that idea that emphasizes reciprocity, and this Tlingit value that is so significant. So it was read as a gift of Christian love, but I think you can also read it as a gift of Tlingit love here. And I spent many days, trying to track down this young woman, and I still think we can figure out who she is. But I went through, census documents and all sorts of things, trying to kind of narrow down who this young woman might be. But maybe somebody in the community might be interested and we could work on that together. One of my favorite stories. I also was, of course, taken by the amazing E.W. Merrill photographs of the last potlatch here in Sitka, the so-called last potlatch here in Sitka, Alaska in 1904. And I look at these photographs, and this photograph that I'm showing you here is, of course, one that's been published and circulated all over the place and used to talk about the Kuik and those sorts of really important cultural moments. But when I look at this photograph, I see all the beading in there. And that beading is, women were creating this incredible beadwork to dress the people who are doing this important work in a time when, that might have been the last one. I mean, that was the language that was being spoken of at that time. And because ethnographers and collectors didn't recognize beading created in Southeast Alaska as authentic because it was made from trade materials, it was overlooked. And so it was doing so much work. It was, carrying on these cultural values in really important ways. And so as I combed museum collections and archives, I started to identify pieces of beading that are in these photographs. And so I'm just showing you one example here, worn by Teet Milton. He was identified by Frederica de Laguna a number of years ago. But you can see, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but he's wearing this octopus bag that's now in a collection in Anchorage. So, trying to connect those beaded pieces with their wearers, the people who wear them, was really important as well. I also looked at these photographs for thinking about connections to the interior. I'm showing you the Wáan guests who are photographed together here. And those relationships to the interior were incredibly important, especially for beading coming into Southeast Alaska. That was one of the ways in which it arrived here, through trade, through marriage, and so forth. And so, you can see some of the Athabascan influence. Again, my pointer. On the gentleman standing at the far right side, he's wearing a V-yoke tunic that's all geometric beadwork, which relates to basketry. And he's also wearing some really amazing other beadwork. This collar here in the Portland Art Museum, which looks, draws on the same sort of design as Chilkat weaving, nahin. And also, I think this pair of leggings that he's wearing below, where that beader had incredible creativity, and you just can imagine what she used beading and the color and design, and just took it to some place that nobody else had taken it at that point. And I just think, beading was such a material of innovation, a material of creativity that women in the 19th century just took and ran with. And so I love that so much. So then I jump into the middle part of the 20th century, and I was incredibly inspired by Larry McNeil's work, this particular photo collage called Once Upon a Time in America from 2002. And I loved it because you look at it, and right at the center, you see Larry's mom, you see his grandma. So his mom, Anita McNeil, his grandmother, Mary Brown Betts, and they are holding moccasins. His grandmother is stitching a moccasin, his mother is holding up a pair of moccasins. And to me, it's just so symbolic and such a strong metaphor for what women were doing to survive the 20th century. It was a really dark time with all of the oppression that was happening, the discrimination that was happening, and yet, women were beading and they were supporting their families, and they were able to continue these cultural practices that had so much meaning. They were fighting for education too, and I think that connects so well with the theme of our conference this week, is that education was so important that Mary Brown Betts was sewing and beading and selling her moccasins so that her daughter could go to the white school and become the valedictorian. Right, so she knew the value of that education, and she knew the value of Anita McNeil going there, who was a fighter too. And one of my favorite stories in talking with Larry, we've had many conversations about these histories, was that this is also all based on records at the Alaska Historical Library. The Alaska Native Arts and Crafts Cooperative has a huge archive of all of the women over 500 women who beaded and sold their moccasins through Anak. And so I thought, I'm having this conversation with Larry. I'm going to go to the archives and see if I can find the cards that, that say, Mary Brown Betts sent in, 10 moccasins this week, 10 pairs of moccasins. Anita McNeil submitted this many. And I did. I found those cards, so I scanned them and I sent them to Larry. And a couple days later, Larry emails me back and he says, "Oh, I see that my mom took a little tiny break after, for a couple weeks after I was born, but then she was right back at it." So just thinking about, the way in which these women, all aunties and grandmas and moms who were, working, they were caring for their children, they were, doing the work of survival, but creating beautiful things at the same time, right? It was just, I love that story from Larry. It was great. That's definitely in the book. Yeah, I know. And I got to talk with your sister Janice. We did a little beader and bead art historian conversation for Ketchikan. I guess was that maybe 2 years ago now, I think. Yeah. So that was wonderful.
I was just going to say, her family, Judson Brown,
Yeah.
he was the very first secretary of the Alaska Native Brotherhood way back then.
Yeah, I know. This is a very sweet family. Yeah. And also that reminds me, just to, this is an image that talks about, Larry always talks about the power of women in his family and that they were warriors, in this case, warriors for education. But this was a photo taken in 1943, right during World War II. And if you see just above the two women, you see a little flag in the window. And this is a home in Juneau where they lived. And they are a Blue Star family, meaning that two of their relatives, the young men in their family, were actually fighting in the war, right? So he is, using that metaphor throughout this, that, Tlingit people have always been warriors, and that, there's different kinds of battles that are being fought. And so on the home front, but also for the United States at that time. So thank you I think was Judson one of those? No, he wasn't. Uncle Austin, yeah, okay, thank you. So let's see, I'm going to bring it up to, Shken, if I had known you were going to be here, I would have shown your photos. I had the great privilege of including the work of 4 contemporary artists who some have done beadwork in the past, but who are now doing other kinds of work, but referencing this history of beadwork. And so I'm just going to share today the work by Tanis Silton, whose mother, some of you may also be familiar with, Maria Ackerman Miller, who I know taught people how to make moccasins, and I think taught people how to do weaving. She also taught her daughter how to be a maker. But I also had Shken's work in there. I also had some work by Lily Hope and also the late Chloe French. And, all 4 of these women share a family history of multiple generations of beaders in their families. And while they don't necessarily bead themselves anymore, they still make these references to that family, their moms, their grandmas, that history of creation and knowledge and passing it down. So Tanis's work here, this is a coat that she made. It's an untitled coat, really references, more than 10,000 years of land, of connection to the land and the resources of the land by using freshwater pearls, abalone. She references octopus, both through the grommets that you see on the front of this coat, but also by this pattern of an octopus from the back. And this is the piece of this coat. There's lots of references here again, also of Tlingit people as warriors as well. But this design on the back was actually from moccasins made by her great grandmother. It's a moccasin design. And so I was sitting with Tanis at her home, and we're talking about these things. And she said, "Oh, yeah, I've got all of these patterns in this tin." That, they've got my grandma's patterns, they've got my great-grandmother's patterns, I've got patterns in there. And I said, "You have a tin of patterns?" Because many people I had talked to over the years would tell me about these tins, and I was, just completely intrigued by them. She's like, "Oh, of course, yeah, let me pull that out." And so she pulled it out and she shared it with me. And I was, practically in tears because, I feel like this is a box of treasures right here. This is a box of women's treasure. And that, we have generations of bead patterns here, that they are cut out of cookbooks, they are cut out of envelopes, and they tell the history of these families. And I'm just so thrilled that Tana has trusted me with this treasure, this box of treasures. And so, that was one of my favorite stories as well in this book was that we got to do that. So my epilogue looks at this hat. Well, it looks at the maker of this hat by a woman who many of you may know, Anaslaga. She was of the Tantaquan. She married a Hudson's Bay factor, and she then settled in Fort Rupert in Kwakwaka'wakw territory. And I came across this hat when I was doing some work at the Canadian Museum of History in Ottawa, and I saw it and I looked at it, and it said it was a Tlingit artist, but it was called a sisiyuth, or it wasn't even called a sisiyuth. It was described this way: a beaded hat worn by the chief of the Tungus tribe. The center is a crest, specie of duck, and the two at the sides are the hook-nosed salmon. The back with the horned head represents the mountain demon in Indian language, Fort Rupert. And I was like, this is such an interesting description of this hat. And then, I started doing a little research, and I realized this is actually associated with Anaslaga, Tungus, the fact that it was identified as Tlingit, and then I recognized the form, though, as the sisiyuth, which is, a supernatural snake in Kwakwaka'wakw culture, and realized that this, has this association. And I started doing more research and talking with some folks in Fort Rupert and elsewhere, and there's all sorts of these hats that exist, and they all show this sisiyuth, and they are a lot of times associated with the Hunt family because she married a man named Robert Hunt. So I'm just showing you this photograph. It's a little hard to see, but this was taken, I think in 1894, there was a newspaper went around Vancouver Island and took photographs and did stories, but this one was from Fort Rupert, and it's believed to be the Hunt family, primarily because Anaslaga was most known for her weaving. And she was quite well known for bringing Nakin weaving to Fort Rupert, to Kwakwaka'wakw territory, but not teaching any of the Kwakwaka'wakw women. She said, this is the thing that I can do, and I'm not going to teach it to you. So the only people in Kwakwaka'wakw territory who can wear these robes are people who are descendants of Anaslaga, right? But if you look closely, which you can't really see here, the man who is posed wearing Anaslaga's robe is also wearing one of these beaded hats. And there's lots of different stories about who actually beaded this. There were several different beaders at work. You can tell from the beading is all different, but associated, so these trade routes that crossed over, the U.S. border, the U.S.-Canada border, these practices continued despite, what settlers were doing to try and halt practices such as cultural knowledge, such as potlatching and so forth. And then I also, in this chapter, bring it up to the present and talk about all of the people, how significant beading is across North America, right? And on the Northwest Coast, there are contemporary artists, as I said, who are referencing the history of beadwork, but in different kinds of media. And this is a piece by Marianne Nicholson, who's a Kwakwaka'wakw artist. This is painting a diptych of a tunic that she created to honor her grandmother, who she feels, women lost their voice in the Kwakwaka'wakw Big House, and so she's a linguist, she's a writer, she's an incredibly talented artist, and she uses all of these tools in order to kind of find those histories that were hidden away. And so here she's created this painting of a tunic with dentalia of a sisiyuth hanging over the shoulders of the tunic to show the weightiness, the importance of women. She has put quarters in the eyes of the coppers that you see in the background of the tunic to denote all of the 16 children that she had, and this is also a Kwakwaka'wakw thing that happens where quarters are distributed when a child is born. So she's really, again, trying to right the wrongs of settler colonialism through her artwork to bring attention to women and the roles that they play that have often been overlooked or ignored. So that is kind of the Cliff's Note version of my book. There's a lot more detail there. There's probably almost 100 images in that book. We were able to get a grant through the press in order to be able to have lots and lots of imagery included in it. The database that I created in order to do this research had over 1,000 pieces of beadwork that are scattered throughout museum collections in North America. And so I wanted to get as many of those images into this book as possible. So I want to now move briefly. I don't want to go too much longer talking, but I told you I was going to talk a lot. It's just to talk about untold stories and unanswered questions. So I'm including a quote here by Métis scholar. She's an incredible scholar, talking about going into museums and finding these unnamed, undocumented pieces on museum shelves that were made by women. And she writes, "There are objects encoded with knowledge. They are the raw materials of women's history." And this is true. I think nobody knows the statistic, but so much of the indigenous materials that are in museum collections are made by women. And they are not named, and they are sitting there, and they are just waiting for community to come back in there and to reclaim them. And so, this is, I think, the thing that's starting to happen now. There's so many indigenous scholars who are now doing that really significant work, and it's exciting to see that. So one of the untold stories, this was actually, the beginning story of my dissertation was this pair of moccasins. I had a conversation with Pamela Bogda, who at the time was working at the Sea Alaska Heritage, and I was a visiting scholar there, and I had this book of, this is old school, I had a book of blown up photographs to show people and to talk about some of these beaded items. And she looked at that, she said, "I think that's by my grandmother, Annie White from Hoona." I was like blown away. So, this is one of the things that I did not have enough time to do, which was to really spend time and to really try and track down the names of people and to try and reconnect the cultural belongings in museums with their makers. And I'm sure that knowledge is out there. It's in community. People are going to look at this work and they're going to say, "That's actually, I know who made that." So that's one of the things that is not, there's not enough of that. That's one of the big unanswered questions, is identifying the makers of cultural belongings in museum collections. The other thing is, I've been very intrigued by the pattern that you see on that moccasin top. It's an eagle with a heart at its center. And I just, I come across a number of them over time, and I've always been like, where did that come from, right? And so what I'm going to share with you next, very briefly, is very, very, very preliminary thinking about this particular design. And I welcome all feedback that you have, because this is just something that I think is going to maybe hopefully fill in a little bit more about women's history and the relationships between people, both on the coast here, but also in the interior, because I think there's possibly an interior connection here as well. So again, expanding women's knowledge about women, but also connecting communities across borders. And I'm just showing you a few pieces of beading, all a little bit different, that I'm going to share with you here quickly. Well, of course, eagles are so important here. In Southeast Alaska, it's one of the main moieties, and that this is a given in this work. And I think that artists were kind of looking at other ways in which eagles were being depicted. And one of those ways, of course, in the 19th century was looking at these American coins that were floating around and circulating all throughout Southeast Alaska and even into Canada. And Katie Bunn-Marcuse has done a lot of research on the history of silversmithing, and that so many of these coins were then turned into bracelets. And here you can see one that by Zacharias Nicholas, he's Haida, but he's pretty well duplicated the same eagle shape that you see on that coin. And both Katie and also Dr. Emily Moore, have talked a little bit about how this particular kind of American eagle design has also been incorporated into a pole, but also was incorporated into beading. This is this amazing wall pocket at the Denver Art Museum. There's not a lot known about it. But you can see, I've just given you I pulled out a detail from the top where you have that eagle with the outspread wings with the shield at its center, right? So that same sort of design. But there's other kinds of beading. So a couple of pieces of regalia. One from the north, the piece at the top is something that looked like it probably attached to a tunic. And I've actually seen it in a photograph by Winter and Pond in Wáan. So there's a Wáan connection there. And then the collar at the bottom was purchased out of a gift shop in Ketchikan in the middle part of the 20th century. But again, you can see both of these eagles have shield shapes at their chests, so they're kind of referencing that American eagle. But their wings are totally different, and I was like, what's that all about? But, so I kept looking and digging around a little bit, and I realized, let's see, here we go. The Great Seal of the United States is another way in which this eagle has been depicted, but with the wings upraised here. And this would have been something that might have been seen on documents. That's often what it was used for. It's used for treaties and that sort of a thing. So this might be another one of the kind of other influences for this design. And you can see it in the top especially. There's the eagle, and in its claws it has arrows, just like the Great Seal here, as well as looks like some greenery. What I love is in the regalia, Mary was its wearer, that's her name, but instead of arrows, she has seaweed. So I could say some things about seaweed, but I won't. The other eagle, of course, is the Russian eagle, and I'm just showing you one of the Allies of Russia medals that was given to some clan leaders in, quite early on. Also, you can't see it here very well, but the 1 kopeck coin also has the double-headed eagle. I came across this. Also, this is in I don't know, there's no information with this, but somebody beaded this Russian eagle. And so this one also has the upraised arms. And there are some pieces of beadwork that have the double-headed eagle with the crowns. So there's a Russian connection there, the American eagle with the upraised with the upraised wings. And so the one at the top is actually was collected in the early 20th century. It's now at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. Steve Henriksen told me he found a little gold poke bag on eBay, and he doesn't have any more information than that. But again, it has that sort of design on it. So I was really kind of, fascinated by that. But what is fascinating to me is that there's hearts in the middle here. So at some point, somebody decided to remove that shield and replace it with a heart. And so, again, Katie has come across bracelets where hearts are included. There's certainly some beaded pieces made for the souvenir trade, for the tourist trade, that are beaded. This is a little pincushion with a seaweed design on it, but would have probably been made for tourists. There was fabric that was circulating around in Southeast Alaska in the 19th century that has heart designs on it, so another possible inspiration. Also, I just came across this deer heart, which I understand is the first green to come up in Southeast Alaska, and it's the first edible green. And so, there's that kind of connection to the land here that exists with that heart shape as well. But my other thought was, and this is where, I might be wrong, I probably am, who knows, I'm open to everything, is again, looking at this, but thinking about, the borders, right? That knowledge that has crossed the border, but because it's hard to kind of break through it in a lot of ways academically, that these things haven't necessarily been connected. So I have done some work at the Canadian Museum of History, and there are a couple of pieces there that are inland Tlingit from around 1912, and here you have, the eagle with the heart at the center. And so my thought is, even though there were some American eagle coins from the US that traveled up there, there was a different resonance there, right? In Canada, of course, it was the British crown that was maybe the kind of symbolic that had the symbolic weight. So perhaps it was a beater in that area that might have said, that shield doesn't mean anything to me, I'm gonna try something else, and looked at a piece of fabric or something else and put that heart there instead. And then, again, a pattern, a design traveled back to the coast and was incorporated there. So again, like I said, very speculative, but this is, this is what we nerdy scholars do, right? Is try to dig down and then start to try and find the answers. So again, that brings me back to this amazing pair of beaded moccasins by Annie White. I also think about lovebirds. When did that design start? I'm really curious about that too. But again, these relationships, these intergenerational knowledge that's passed down, these designs that are traded between people, all of these things connect here. And I just want to end with 2 more slides, and then I will stop because I'm talking longer than I meant to. So right now, beadwork is having a huge moment. There's a show that is traveling around Canada called Radical Stitch, and it was organized by 3 Indigenous beaders, and they are brought together all of these contemporary works by contemporary beaders. All of these beaders, use that long history of beading within their own families, but speak to, histories of colonialism, to the kinds of diseases that were brought in, but also to the joy and the resilience and of people, and also humor. All of these things that we all appreciate. So just to give you 3 examples, Nico Williams, who's Ojibwe, creates these kind of 3-dimensional beaded forms. Ruth Cuthand, who's Cree, does these amazing series of, the kinds of diseases that were brought in through settler colonialism. Terry Greaves, she's Kiowa from the lower 48, who does, she beads a lot of shoes, but she also, made this, I thought, really quite great piece where he's saying art and wearing a headdress, and there's, all sorts of things around that. So, beading is really important, and it's important across North America. Those trade relationships were so significant. But women's art, more broadly, is finally being recognized, too, across North America. And Katie and I had the honor of contributing an essay to this exhibition catalog from 2019, Hearts of Our People, Native Women Artists, Native American Women Artists. And that was the first time ever there had been a huge show devoted only to Indigenous women, 2019, right? And so this is a really amazing time, and I love to see what's happening in Southeast Alaska, only in Southeast Alaska, but expand that to all of North America, what women are doing, the mediums they're experimenting with. Just a few, Alison Bremner's paintings, Lily Hope's Chilkat protector mask, Jennifer Younger on the cover of Vogue magazine with her amazing jewelry, and of course Crystal Worrell and her airplane that goes all over the place. It's amazing. So there's incredible work happening right now, and I just love it. Just to finish, Gunis Chish to all of the people, and I know there's more people who probably didn't make it on this list because I didn't take good enough notes, but this is a small handful of people who spoke with me, who shared their knowledge, and I just also am ending here with Chloe French's amazing collar that was auctioned off at the for the building of the Walter Soboleff building, and it was acquired by the University of Alaska Museum of the North. This is an image of a petroglyph here in Sitka, and again, showing this, thousands and thousands of years of connection to the land and how beautiful it is and how deep it is, and I just, I think it's such a powerful piece. Again, it represents, along with all of these other works, the amazing work that's being produced here that asserts Tlingit worldviews and ways of knowing. And, as I kind of close my book, I really think that beadwork has really contributed to the resilience of Tlingit people, to the power of women, and that, for over 150 years, and it's really, continues to inspire artists in really creative and innovative ways. And I hope that it captured just a small amount of that in my book. I'm just so grateful that I've had this opportunity to do this work and had some really wonderful people who shared their knowledge with me. So with that, I'm just gonna put one more slide up. What are the futures of beading here in Southeast Alaska? And that's a question for you to ponder, to maybe we have conversation about what are the stories that still need to be told. And, I'd love to be a part of that, but there are lots of people who are doing really important work. And so with that, I'm going to say thank you and happy to answer questions after this. So thank you so much. Ganesh Cheese.
Oh yeah, we do have a little time for questions. Would anybody like to ask Megan a question? I can bring you the mic.
Ganesh for your words today. I am a big fan of your book. You included my great-grandmother's beaded doll in there, and my mother beads, I bead, and so we're one of those. One of the stories I would love is to know more and to explore more is why did we have the rise of beaded dolls? Why did we do beaded faces? Instead of, if you look across Alaska, the dolls, most other places didn't go with beaded dolls. Why did we go with beaded dolls? We have Alice Johnny, we had Annie Lawrence who did it, and many others from Huna and Wáan. And so that's one of the stories I would love to see is the history of Tlingit dolls. Goodness sheesh.
Yeah, that's great. And there's a little bit in there in the book, I think. But yeah, there was this kind of Alaska doll, which was, there's this kind of almost a generic Alaskan doll that was sold often to tourists, where it was made often from seal skin with a fur ruff, but made in Southeast Alaska by Tlingit women. But at some point, and I found this tiny note in the Alaska Native Arts and Crafts Cooperative archive, and that basically some of the women were there like, we're really tired of making this doll. We want to make a doll that reflects who we are. And so sometime probably in the 1950s, there were women who started to make those dolls wearing regalia, and often instead of having a woven robe, the design would be beaded on the back. So, I think you're right. It needs to be expanded, and the names need to be attached to those dolls, and I think that's a great story that could be told in much more detail. So thank you for that, Ganesh.
Thank you, Megan. What a great presentation, and what great Indigenous knowledge that you're bringing to us. So I was really pleased to see my great-grandma in the photo, Mary Spurgeon Betts, who, of course, was the mother of Judson Brown. But I actually do have a question for you. So is there any connection in the research that you've done in looking at the diffusion of the bandolier bag and how it relates to the octopus bag? Because it seems like it started on the East Coast and then came to the West, or did it come north and come south? I'm still trying to figure that out, because you see different iterations of a bandolier bag or octopus bag, so I was just curious about that.
So I'm not an expert so much on, I'm not really an expert on anything. I always say the more I learn, the less I know. And that is so true. I know Kate Duncan had done some tracing of the octopus bag across North America. The Taltan have kind of an ammunition pouch that, interestingly enough, did not start being made here in Southeast Alaska. And so, Okay, after, yeah. Happy to answer. And so I think, as I kind of talk about in the book, I think what was so intriguing to women in the 19th century with the octopus bag was that connection to, the 4 pairs of legs that hung below. And in those early bags, you see so much experimentation in terms of what was on there. There's flowers, there's kind of different kinds of designs, and it seems like through time it kind of condensed a little bit down into seaweed designs primarily, but some floral designs still. I don't really know how the bandolier bag, because I don't know if it made it all the way across here. I know the octopus bag came from Cree territory and through trade routes, made its way across, and then was, because on the coast, really the only place that makes octopus bags is here, in Southeast Alaska. And I think I've also said that, the Russian Orthodox influence as well, with the banners that hang in the cathedrals with the same sorts of pendants, so there's that idea of synchronicity in a sense, or syncretism to display and to regalia, that these are the reasons why octopus bags really became an important part of regalia in this place. So I'm not sure I'm really answering your question. But it's a good question. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Oh, sorry, Mike. Yeah.
Getting my steps in.
Chatzach tuasi gugun chishe da chakaya iejinei yaha kunachda kienige. Thank you so much for explaining the work that you're doing. My question has to do with the technique that is developed within the Tlingit territory, or the ones that is talked about in Tlingit territory. And the technique I'm thinking about is the 2 needles versus 1 needle of the beadwork. Is it possible that you can tell us a little bit more about what your experience is with that type of technique?
That is a question for somebody in the audience who's a beater.
The difference is like Kiko Matt and the toy. I don't know if there's any.
I don't feel comfortable speaking to that question since I am not a beater. I just study beading. So are there any beaters in the audience who might be able to share or would be comfortable sharing that knowledge?
Where it came from,
do you know where that technique came from?
But I also just recently learned of a third one that Grandma Florence does, which is a double needle technique, but using only a single thread needle. And so it goes back and tacking instead of going through the beads.
So I think you need to talk to the technical masters for this one.
You mean my auntie?
Not your auntie. Absolutely.
I'll talk all day.
Thank you, though. It's important that kind of the materiality, the making of it. There's incredible history in that as well. And again, that's one of the untold stories that I was unable to get to in my work. So thank you for bringing that up.
Testing. Oh, great.
Good afternoon for your presentation and your research, your hard work. I know that my auntie, my grandmother, had a little sewing box at Virginia's house, Virginia Oliver, when I went to visit her, and she showed it to me. And just like the box that you showed with the patterns, how beautiful and sacred those are. And there's times that we spend time with objects that are like portals that take us into many different worlds in a good way. So my question is, I remember watching some of the elders bead, and they would stop in the middle and they would have all of these good feelings for whoever, they were going to gift that or to the opposite or whatever they were making for it. But I remember a little song, and they would stop in the beadwork, the fine beadwork, and then they would take a slightly broken bead or a slightly different color bead or something, or no bead at all, and they would not make it perfect. Like life sometimes, it's not perfect. But they would put that spirit bead or ghost bead or that special absence of bead into their work. I wonder if you, through your research or your work, or anybody here knows a little bit more about that story, and if it's an untold story and something that we just experience as a people, that's okay too.
Yeah. That's a great question. I have seen work in museum collections that have that bead, right, in that one color that's the only one, and it's like, this is not a mistake that bead is there, because, here's a vast bit of white, beautiful white beads, and then there's one little blue bead kind of right in the middle. And so I think this is absolutely something that was done historically and possibly as well in the present. And I think it's really neat to point that out. I did not talk about that in my book, but I've certainly seen a lot of it in the beadwork I had a chance to see. Yeah.
Excuse me. Yake Gunas Chish, Linda, Carol, Yuhakduasak. Joseph, that's a great question. I believe that both of those questions for inspiring our new and younger beaders are really important.
why I call it overcasting. I was explained that in order to do productive large pieces like Esther Littlefield did, took time, a lot of time. So we discipline ourselves by process. And through the process, Native Americans believed nothing was perfect. So they put one bead in there for the significance of knowing that we are born in this world and nothing is perfect. There's always something that will be, so they wanted to identify that in the work. That's what I learned through my years of sewing. Yeah. So one of the things that, I'm Haida, and my mom came here when SJ was a high school, and when we were teenagers, we went down to Totem Park and learned how to sew beadwork, and Esther Littlefield would sit by our side, by my side, and she would talk to me and tell me stuff, and she always held me up. Now, it's to inspire more Tlingit beadwork for your vest, and your brothers who are like master beaders just like Florence, and the stories that they would sit down and tell with the heart in the middle. We're going through so many hard times right now in our life, and we, in Sitka, I heard it was a lady in Sitka saying, we gotta learn how to get along. I've heard it 2 or 3 times now. But sharing our love for one another, sharing our experiences, our history with one another, that's how we learned, and that's how we share our culture. I was told that we should always acknowledge our teachers, and there are many when you get to be my age, but Esther Littlefield was one of the most wonderful teachers for me in my life. And to be able to sit next to a granddaughter of Chief Catlian, it was like I come back here and I'm like so proud. You know, I know a lot of this stuff is within us. It's there. But the real trick is really teaching ourselves and teaching our children the best that you can in the most positive way. Putting that love into our work, trying to understand how it was a long time ago, because it's not that way anymore. I've seen little kids won't even dance until they put a robe on, and next thing you know, they're like wings flying. And it's so amazing, and we've had that conversation about regalia and robes, and but we need to pay attention and humbling our words, how we teach, how we share. I'm really proud of the younger generation and having our uncles holding us up. It really means a lot to be here. I'm really thankful for Goldbach Heritage Foundation to be able to support us, to be able to share our stories about what it was like to be brought up in Sitka. I have family here. I have an uncle in the Pioneers home, but my mom came from Heidelberg, and then she married my father. I'm Deshi Tanyadi. I'm a child of the Raven Beaver. A lot of people just think I'm Haida, but guess what? Anyways, Deawe Gunachish.
Goodness, Chish, are there any more questions for Megan?
Did you come across your scholarship and interviews with our women about the transition differences between the double line designs and the filled-in designs?
An untold story. No, no, it's one of those unanswered questions, and I think I'm really curious about that too, because we've seen full regalia that's all filled in, or just 1 or 2 lines. More, it's always 2 lines at least, but I've seen 3 lines, you know, so I kind of wonder if it's just, you know, individual style and choice, but don't quote me on that, I don't know. But with more research, that might be something that could be figured out, because there are pieces in, like the National Museum of American Indian, I know has, I think, a whole set of regalia with a filled in kind of the seaweed motifs and that sort of thing. So it's amazing the diversity of design. You know, I feel like in a lot of ways, beading allowed women to really experiment, you know, that it was color, it was the size of the beads, it was the patterns that they were seeing all around them, both in nature, but also on the sorts of things that were being brought in for trade, and that because it wasn't a new art form. Like there's always been adornment. There's archaeological sites that have beads in them, but the ability to kind of use those seed beads to create crests, to create seaweed designs. You know, this was something that I think was very freeing in a lot of ways in the 19th century. So, yeah.
All right, can we get one more round of applause for Megan Gunachi?